Welcome back to part 2 of the Wednesday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know the drill. Recording on Tuesday morning. And of course, if you're hearing this on Wednesday, it's Christmas Eve. So I'm going to start with another opening thought. I don't always do it for part 2, but I have to. And the focus of my part 2 opening thought is once again JD Vance. So we know JD Vance talked about the Christian nation, and we had a rabbi respond to that. Now we're going to be talking about whiteness, okay? Because that's another thing that JD Vance seemed to talk about. And I grabbed something from Paul Waldman's Substack. And for those of you who don't know who Paul Waldman is, he's a liberal American op-ed columnist. He was a senior writer for the American Prospect. He's a contributor to The Week. He's been a blogger at the Washington Post Plumline blog. So he's fairly well known. And this is what he writes, and I'm only going to read a portion of it. I would love to read you the whole article, but we don't have the time. But this is the title of his piece at his Substack. Why JD Vance Can't Ride Whiteness to the White House. The battle for the future of the Republican Party is underway, or at least the battle to determine who will lead it in 2028. As vice president, JD Vance has the inside track, but he knows the field will not clear for him. So he's working hard to articulate a vision to define himself in the country he wishes to lead. That vision, articulated in a series of speeches and interviews over the last year and a half, is one of naked white supremacy and ethno-nationalism. The good news is that Vance is a terrible messenger for this hateful ideology, and his chances of taking it to the Oval Office are extremely slim. The bad news is that there is clearly a sizable market for it within the Republican Party. Speaking Sunday at the annual Turning Point USA conference known as AmericaFest, Vance had a message for the assembled Herrenvolk. White pride is back, baby. And then he goes on. I refuse to apologize for being white has long been a mantra of segregationists and Klansmen, an outgrowth of the fear that any sort of equality for racial minorities, legal, economic, educational, by definition, meant putting whites in a subservient position, forced to hang their heads and apologize. Equality is perceived to be a reversal of the racial hierarchy. If we're not in a state of privilege, free to abuse our lessers, then it can only mean we're being abused. So who exactly has been demanding that JD Vance apologize for being white? ? Has that ever happened to him? I mean, a single time? Of course not. But this is a key element of Trumpism, of which Vance would like to be the heir. You have been humiliated, it says, but I will let you stand tall again. You white people, and especially white men, have been hounded and oppressed, but those days are finally over. All right. And so it goes on. But I had to pick that up because this is our monthly teaching of race class. And we've been doing this for now 4 years now, which is kind of amazing, Jonathan Feingold. And as I remind everyone at the beginning of our race class, that legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. Boy, remember, this sounds so naive from like 4 years ago when we were looking at where we are today, Jonathan.
No, we were prescient. It was not naive. We knew what was going on.
You got it. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and myself have offered a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. So let me welcome you back to the program at this end of December 2025. Jonathan, we've been doing this together for a long time. There's so many different ways we can go with this because there is no question, as you point out, that the Department of Justice has now made discrimination great again. And I think when we started 4 years ago, we were somewhat horrified at what we saw with the attacks on DEI and CRT and what we saw with the whitewashing of history. But we'd seen versions of that, Jonathan, at that time. Where we are today is at a level and extreme that is hard for me to comprehend because so many people are out and so few people are in. I mean, when you think of the in group is this tiny group of white men white Christian men, and preferably white Christian men with money. I mean, that's really where they would like to go. And I'm looking at the rest of us, and I feel like, but yet, because of the grotesque inequality in America, because of the rise of the billionaire, because of the money in politics, this small little group of racist Christians are now able to do so much demolish the country that I love. And as you point out, the DOJ policies are now making discrimination great again. And this is the Department of Justice. I'm not sure the word justice applies anymore. So let me welcome you back to the program. And sort of at the end of this 2025, where do we want to go? But it appears that you're looking at the Department of Justice and trying to figure out, okay, what are they basically telling us to do and how to behave?
So nice to be with you, Arnie.
Lovely.
Um, I w so I have a lot of thoughts. One is that I think descriptively it's exactly right that what the Trump administration, in cahoots with a whole number of allied groups and organizations, from ALEC to the Heritage Foundation, Manhattan Institute, Turning Point USA, is part of a modern day movement. It is in the most sort of literal, nostalgic sense of MAGA,
Mm-hmm.
to return to a time in which it was, you would not, where it was fully socially acceptable to expect and feel entitled to a just racial, gender, religious sorts of norms that centered whiteness, centered a certain sort of Christianity that was deeply patriarchal, which
Mm-hmm.
folks knew like what roles they had. Uh, And like none of that is hidden. JD Vance, like you referenced the JD Vance Turning Point USA speech. It's all very uh, you know, explicit about what the project is. The attack on sort of immigrants is it's about purging the wrong people from the country. And in violent, dehumanizing ways. I do think, though, we should be careful and not say that, this is just a project of people who are white and people who are male and people who are Christian. Certainly, it is about entrenching and erecting a system in which, whiteness and certain form of Christianity, um, and men are sort of centered hierarchically. But if you look in the Trump administration, there's some gender diversity there. There's some racial diversity there, which is just, to recognize that, there is a distinction between, the systems and sort of the ideology that is being valorized, and individuals who are going to, occupy spaces in different sorts of ways. Though there was an interesting poll that just came out yesterday that showed Trump underwater with every single group, as in the standard ways we break it up, except for Republicans, in which I think his approval rating was like, um, like 90, like 80 or 90%. But even, in folks of people of color or non-white, I think was how this was described. It was, 3-1 disprove, but that's
Mm-hmm.
still a quarter approve.
Mm-hmm.
And white people who identified as white is the first time I've seen a poll in which a majority disprove, but it's still, 40. And so, which is just all to say, um, there's some complexity there, and there is a um, sort of interfaith, sort of uh, interracial. So, like they're women who drive and have always driven a lot of the hardcore right wing, like um,
Oh, Christy Nome, Caroline
Christian, like
Levitt. I mean, all those
and
people. But are they equal, or do they know how to promote the men? I mean,
well,
so
so
this is a
I
question I have for you. Yeah, they happen to be part of his cabinet, or they happen to be part of his administration. But in what capacity are they part of? And I kind of see them as dressing the part, looking the part, and basically serving the master, which is exactly how they want. Yeah, they have a title, but that title doesn't reflect anything in the way of respect or power. It just happens
well,
to be a
so
title.
yeah, I guess all I mean to say is that so if you think of backlash to civil rights movements in the United States, I just think we should not lose sight of the tremendous role that women have played. Women who self-identify as white. If you think sort of post-Civil War, who was leading the effort to redeem the South? If you think of, post Brown, who was, in different, if you think of post George Floyd,
Yeah.
who in many ways are the organizers that are doing key work? Moms for Liberty. And
Yeah.
so, which is not to say that, no, so certainly, if you are entrenching a society that is sort of where the social ordering is, white supremacist, is patriarchal, it's Christian centric, then that is a hierarchy. But, you know, different people are gonna, who, have different identities are gonna navigate it, and play their identity in different sorts of ways. And I just think that it is, always important to recognize how, any sort of patriarchal regime is going to sort of shunt different people into different roles,
Yeah.
but I don't want to, take away the agency of, the Christy Gnomes who are out there doing tremendous harm and making choices to do so, which isn't to say it's in support of some system that is going to be like granting like, full equality for women, but that's just like it is a role that they are playing. Okay, so that's just me riffing on what you said and the conversation we were having before we started recording. You sort of got me going a little bit, and so I'm still amped up. But I want to just say a couple more things, and I'll toss it back over to you, which is just reflecting both on this moment and this thing that we've been doing, race class. Because do you know how many episodes we've recorded?
No, how many? Don't you-
So it's now 53.
Oh my
50,
God.
it's been so 4 years.
Yeah.
And I've never before really had a chance to listen back, but now I've just been curious. And one thing that I listened to recently was, so 3 years ago,
Hmm.
in the first year we were doing it, that summer, 2022, we did this whole mini series on affirmative action. And the question that we asked was, well, how does race matter before, during, and after admissions if universities are no longer able to account for the racial identity of individual applicants? Because the whole point was that we know race matters in all these sorts of ways. Affirmative action is intervening against that in order to promote a more equitable and more meritocratic system. And it was like, and so for me, it was actually interesting just listening to some of those conversations, including some of our guests, like
Hmm.
Jerry Kong, Dr. Evelyn Carter, who are really thoughtful folks and actually, care about facts, and just really the could not be starker contrast between that and living in a world where we are constantly getting gaslit by the federal government.
Yes.
Like the JD Vance shit, I guess I don't know,
Oh,
I'm not
can't say that
maybe, so
word. All
can't
right.
say that word.
Blip that word. Blip that word. Okay, keep going.
My
The JD
apologies.
Vance language.
The JD Vance, like, um, it's, it is, it's hard, I think, to capture when you are in real time, when you are enmeshed in the most hardcore effort to recuperate whiteness and and just to make it natural to live in a society in which whiteness is defined by its domination
Yeah.
of others. That requires disregarding how the world works. And because everything that JD Vance, and so there's just a degree to which we are trapped in this moment right now, or maybe trapped's not the right word, but we are sort of in this moment right now in which we're constantly being bombarded with lies from the federal government in like everywhere. And it's just, and part of the design is actually to make it hard for us to make us lose our minds so that we
Yeah.
cannot see what should just be so obviously described as, one of the most hate-filled, um, barbaric, grotesque, white supremacist projects of domination that we have seen in this country, like
Well,
certainly since not since the civil rights movement.
I mean, again, if you are trying to say that whiteness is the norm, then if that's the norm, then the rest of us are not norm. I mean, anyone that is not white is by definition abnormal, not belonging, whatever it is. And so you wrote this piece, and the piece was about the Department of Justice's recent rule eliminating disparate impact liability. Now, explain to my audience what eliminating disparate impact liability means and why, as you point out, it's a decades-long campaign to invert the Civil Rights Act, and that makes racial discrimination harder to detect by opening the door to creative new types of racial exclusion. Let them
So
understand what this means. When you hear the word disparate impact, what the H is that?
so and the piece you reference is one that will be forthcoming with Victor Ray, who's he's actually come on our show before.
Mm-hmm.
Really great guy, really thoughtful scholar of race and racism. And Victor earlier this year described the Trump administration's agenda as segregationist. He used the word segregationist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it remains hard for I think descriptively he's right. I think that's an accurate statement for what the Trump administration is trying to do and quite effectively has done, just with the way that it has sort of um, leveraged the power of the federal government to push people of color, to push white women uh, out of the workforce, out of centers of power, out of universities.
Mm-hmm.
And the federal government, the Department of Justice's attack on disparate impact is a piece of this. And the attack on disparate impact was called for by the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. But you ask, what is this thing, disparate impact? Unless you're a lawyer, you probably haven't really heard of it. But so put yourself in, the early 1960s
Mm-hmm.
and the status quo. All of our premier institutions, industries, domains are dominated by white men, in part because they've been defined by both formal and informal mechanisms of exclusion that are rationalized sort of based on both racialized and gendered tropes of white male excellence relative to everyone else. And so the question is, how do not just sort of prevent the overt discrimination, but how do you actually try to implement policies on the ground in, for example, corporate in like Fortune 500 companies like Delta or Boeing that begin to sort of just shift the daily operation of these organizations so that they are no longer just defaulting to exclusionary practices, whether that's, good old boy sorts of clubs or defaulting to standards or sort of entry requirements that aren't, actually tethered to a job's requirement, but is just, how things have always been done. And so there's in the mid 1960s, and around then, there's actually a lot of fighting over how um, aggressive the federal government should be and individual companies should be in remedying what is now centuries of both gendered and race-based exclusion. And disparate impact is one of the places where people land that had broad support from President Kennedy, from Lyndon Johnson, to you know moderate Republican conservatives. And so Susan Carl, who's a legal scholar, she wrote earlier this year when Trump issued an executive order that foreshadowed the recent DOJ rule rescinding disparate impact. And in that executive order, it's just the standard Trump language that is detached from reality. He refers to disparate impact as, part of this pernicious, quote unquote, pernicious system. And one of the sort of goals in the JD Vance rhetoric is to revise history, to make it, to present as like radical and leftist and whatever other word they're going to attach to it, very modest policies that were introduced in the mid 20th century that had wide appeal. There was actually, the folks that were more frustrated with it were the folks on the left because they did not see disparate impact as sufficiently muscular. And so what does disparate impact do? So disparate impact is a requirement where if you are a business or a university and you have some process, some selection process, for who gets hired, for who gets promoted, for who gets admitted, and you just notice massive disparities. Like let's say you've got, some business, so let's say some contractor, like construction business, historically just dominated by men. And now there's federal law, and especially sort of uh, post sort of Title VII employment domain, and you continue to see women are just not getting jobs. And so then what the business has to do is they just have to justify that the process they're using, that the requirements are actually job related.
Mhm.
Because if they're not job related, then you shouldn't. And if they're not job related and they are pushing certain people out systematically, then
It
it's
violates the law.
discriminatory.
Yeah.
It's discriminatory, and this is where Susan Carl explains why this is actually a broad consensus that was supported by the business community, because disparate impact, just it's a sensor to see when you are unmindfully operating in a way that is locking certain people out. It gives you an opportunity to course correct. And this is sort of quoting Susan Carl, helps U.S. businesses by encouraging best employment practices through which the most meritorious candidates win the competition for job opportunities. And in, in the DOJ press release and also the Washington Post editorial board. And if you look now at, weeks or a few months of Washington Post editorial board, it's really hard to see daylight between what they write and what Trump admin press releases say. And both described disparate impact as this departure from, the sort of civil rights consensus. And so I just want to quote, I'll quickly quote both Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson, because both of whom, in Kennedy in 1963, when he's introducing Title VI, um, which has the disparate impact regulations that the DOJ is now doing away with, and then Johnson after the bill was passed, both of them make very clear that what these laws must attend to are not just quote unquote intentional discrimination, but also outcomes, also effects.
Mhm.
And so here so quoting Kennedy, simple justice requires that public funds not be spent in any fashion that encourages, entrenches, subsidizes, or results in discrimination. And then Lyndon Johnson, um, at a Howard University commencement address, 1965. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result.
I love it. Equality as a fact and equality as a result. Oh my God. I want that bumper sticker. But yeah, but see, that language explains what they are undermining. That it isn't a new concept. This is Lyndon Baines Johnson saying this. Everyone understood what it meant. And now look at the direction we're going, which is why, again, I started with JD Vance. He wants to normalize the whiteness. He wants to normalize what the DOJ is doing. And as I was thinking about this and listening to you and about disparate impact, do you know what story I went back to, Jonathan? I remember when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was reflecting on being one of the 9 female classmates at Harvard Law School. And what absolutely blew my mind is when one of the deans basically went up to her and asked her what right did she have to take a seat away from a man.
Yeah, JD Vance.
Okay, I mean I want to remind everyone they asked Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Not that the idea was she was taking a seat away from a male, and therefore she should not be there. This is where we were. Okay, this was acceptable. This was understood as the norm, Jonathan. And I think part of the problem is there has really been this drumbeat of distortion, but on the other side, there really hasn't been an explanation of disparate impact, the definition of affirmative action, the understanding of why we're teaching race class. Again, affirmative action. I remember being at Dartmouth College, sitting with a father with two daughters who were about to attend Dartmouth College, and he was railing against affirmative action. And I looked at the two daughters that were sitting across the table, and I said, you know who's benefited the most from affirmative action? Your daughters. Your white daughters. Okay? It
And
opened the door for them too. So again, part of the problem is they're good at the mythology. We're not good at transmitting the story and the facts.
so two final things to
Okay.
sort of say in response. So one is the Vance rhetoric. It is meant to bring us all conceptually to that place that you just described, where the expectation is that to the extent someone is in a position of power in an elite institution and they are not white and they are not male, there was some, corruption to the system. Like
Yes.
that is, and it is absurd and grotesque and just like gaslighting to hear that rhetoric coming from like this current federal administration. But the other thing is the last point you made, which is maybe the most important thing we could say right now, is that we're getting from the Trump administration what we know we're going to get from them. It is a white supremacist Christian nationalist project. But what we're not getting is from the elite universities, from the Fortune 500 companies explaining why they need to be accounting for race and gender in order to cultivate a fair and equitable
And
process.
on that note, this is the end of our race class for 2025. Thank you so much, Jonathan Kleingold, for doing this. And again, remember, it's a once-a-month conversation where we approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. Thank you so much for doing this, Jonathan.
Thanks, Arnie.
This, everyone, is the Wednesday edition of The Attitude. It is also Christmas Eve, so have a lovely holiday. Ciao. We will talk on Friday. Bye-bye.